Aisha's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and her eyes widened. "Grandma, the mayor just put out a statement." The crowd quieted. All eyes turned to her. "What'd he say?" James asked. Aisha hesitated, then read aloud. "The city is aware of the incident involving Officer Timothy Barnes. We are conducting an internal investigation and ask the public to remain patient as we gather facts." Internal investigation. Marcus scoffed. "That's just code for "we gonna cover this up." Miss Hattie wasn't surprised. She had seen this before too. Promises of investigations that led to nothing. Words meant to calm the storm without actually fixing anything. James clenched his jaw. "They're just hoping this dies down." Miss Hattie nodded. "Then we don't let it." Aisha's phone buzzed again. This time, her expression shifted from anger to something closer to shock. "What now?" James asked. Aisha swallowed hard. The officer's wife just made a post. A silence fell over the group. She's saying he hasn't come home. That he left after his shift and won't answer his phone. Miss Hattie's eyes narrowed. That was unexpected. The officer had been so bold, so sure of himself when he stood in front of her. Now he was missing. The tension, already thick, got even heavier. And deep down, Miss Hattie knew this was far from over. The air felt different now. The anger, the frustration, the confusion, none of it had settled. If anything, it had only thickened. Miss Hattie sat back down in her rocking chair, her mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. The officer had done what he did, walked off like it meant nothing, and now he was nowhere to be found. Aisha scrolled through the comments under the officer's wife's post. "People are already speculating," she said. "Some think he ran off because of the backlash. Others think something happened to him." James shook his head. "This don't sit right with me. Man does something like that and just disappears the same night. Either he's hiding or..." He stopped himself, the thought hanging in the air. The front porch felt too small now, too crowded with thoughts and questions. More neighbors had shown up, whispering among themselves, checking their phones for updates. A news van had parked down the block, waiting for a statement from the family. People weren't just watching anymore, they were expecting something. Miss Hattie exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping the arm of her chair. "Somebody knows where he is," she said, almost to herself. Aisha nodded. "If he's missing, somebody had to have seen something." James rubbed his temples. "Mama, I know you don't want to rush to conclusions, but you gotta admit, this don't seem like no coincidence." Miss Hattie didn't respond right away. She just looked out at the street, her mind reaching back through the years to all the times things didn't make sense at first, but always made sense in the end. A sudden noise broke the tension. A phone rang, sharp and loud in the quiet night. It was Aisha's. She hesitated before answering. "Hello." Everyone watched as her face changed, her brows furrowing. "Wait, slow down. Who is this?" A long pause. Then her lips parted slightly, and her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You're lying." James stepped forward. What is it?" Aisha put the call on speaker. A deep voice, shaken and urgent, came through. "I'm telling you the truth. I don't got much time, but you need to listen. That cop, he ain't missing. Somebody got to him first." A ripple of shock went through the group. Miss Hattie's fingers gripped the arm of her chair just a little tighter. James' voice was sharp. "Who is this?" The voice hesitated. "Doesn't matter. Just know. Somebody wanted him gone before this got bigger. And they made sure of it." Aisha swallowed hard. "You mean?" "I mean he ain't coming back." A cold silence fell over the porch. The weight of those words pressed down on them all. Miss Hattie's face remained unreadable, but inside she knew what this meant. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about what had been done to her. This had turned into something else entirely. James took the phone from Aisha. "Listen, if you know something, you need to tell the police." A bitter chuckle came through the speaker. "You really think they don't already know?" They just ain't saying nothing yet. The line went dead. Aisha stared at her screen. They hung up. The street, the porch, the people, all of it felt too still, too quiet, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Miss Hattie finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, but different now. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, but she knew better than to pray for mercy when a storm like this was coming. The silence on the porch felt heavier than before. The night air, once filled with laughter and music, was now thick with something else, something unspoken, something dangerous. Miss Hattie sat still, her face calm, but her eyes said everything. She had lived long enough to recognize when things were spiraling into something bigger than they were meant to be. And this was getting out of control. James let out a slow breath, shaking his head. This don't make no sense. First he does what he did, then he vanishes, and now somebody's saying he's gone for good. Aisha's fingers were tight around her phone, and they're saying the police already know. The murmurs around them grew louder. The neighbors who had stayed to watch were now huddled in groups, whispering, checking their phones, waiting for the next piece of news to drop. The news van down the street was still parked, but now another one had joined it. The world was watching, but none of them knew what they were actually looking at anymore. Miss Hattie finally leaned forward, resting her hands on her lap. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "This ain't how things are supposed to go." James turned to her. "Mama, you think somebody," he hesitated. "You think somebody took matters into their own hands?" Miss Hattie didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she looked out at the street again, her mind racing through all the possibilities. She had seen men disappear before. Sometimes, it was the system making them disappear. Other times, it was something else entirely. Aisha's phone buzzed again. She looked down, then gasped. "Grandma, look." She turned the screen toward Miss Hattie. It was a video, grainy, shaky, like it had been filmed in a hurry. But the image was clear enough. A street light flickered over an empty alley, and there, just barely visible, was the officer's patrol car. The timer stamp, just 2 hours ago. James grabbed the phone, his eyes narrowing. "Where is this?" Aisha's voice was shaky. "It's on the other side of town, near the old train tracks." Marcus, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward. "I know that spot. Ain't nothing back there but abandoned buildings." James' jaw clenched. "Then why's his car there?" No one had an answer. Miss Hattie stood up. The porch creaked beneath her, and the small crowd grew quiet, watching her waiting. She looked at James, then Aisha, then out at the rest of them. "Somebody knows more than they're saying," she murmured. The weight of her words settled over them, because she wasn't just talking about the stranger on the phone. She wasn't just talking about the police. She was talking about someone close, someone in this neighborhood. James nodded slowly, like he understood what she was saying without her having to spell it out. "You think someone here?" Miss Hattie cut him a sharp look. "I think people talk when they feel safe, and right now, ain't nobody feeling safe." Aisha was still staring at her phone, scrolling through the comments under the video. "People are saying someone should go check it out." James shook his head. "That's how folks get hurt." But Aisha was still scrolling, her face growing paler by the second. Then she froze. "Wait, someone else just posted something." James frowned. "What now?" Aisha swallowed hard, then turned the phone so they could all see. It was another video, but this one was worse. This one wasn't just a blurry shot of an alley. This one was up close, too close. The camera shook as the person filming whispered, "I don't think I should be here." The lens zoomed in on the patrol car. The door was slightly open. The inside was dark, but something wasn't right. The figure in the driver's seat wasn't moving. Then, just before the video cut off, something else appeared. A shape. A shadow. Someone was there, watching. And then the screen went black. Aisha's breath was shallow. Whoever filmed this, they stopped posting. A chill ran through the group. Miss Hattie tightened her grip on the porch railing. This wasn't just about what happened in front of her house anymore. This wasn't just about a man spitting on her and walking away. Somebody had stepped into something they weren't ready for. And now? Now, they had all been pulled in. James exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off the cold feeling crawling up his spine. Asa kept staring at her phone, refreshing the page over and over, but no new updates came. The person who filmed that last video had gone silent. The night had never felt so still, yet so full of noise. Miss Hattie, standing firm on the porch, watched the street with knowing eyes. "Ain't no sense in just sitting here," she said finally. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, going through the usual pre-flight instructions. James listened with half an ear, but his thoughts kept drifting. His mother's face flashed in his mind, her warm smile, the way she always welcomed him home with open arms, no matter how long he had been away. He had spent the past year overseas, missing holidays, birthdays, moments he would never get back. This flight was supposed to be a small relief, a moment of comfort before stepping back into the real world. But comfort was the last thing he felt right now. A sudden movement pulled him from his thoughts. The older man had flagged down another flight attendant, a different one from before. She leaned in, listening as he spoke in a hushed but urgent tone. James couldn't make out everything, but he caught enough to understand. "There has to be another seat," the man was saying. "I can't sit here for the whole flight." The flight attendant gave him a patient but firm look. "Sir, the flight is full. I'm afraid there aren't any other seats available." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "What about coach?" James felt his stomach tighten. He could hear the unspoken words beneath the question. The man would rather give up his first-class seat than sit beside him. The flight attendant sighed. "If a seat opens up, I can check for you, but as of now, we're completely booked." The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his window, his jaw set in frustration. James let out a slow breath, trying to keep himself calm. He had thought ignoring the situation would make it easier, but the more the man pushed, the harder it became to stay silent. The weight of years of experiences like this, being questioned, being doubted, being treated as if he didn't belong, settled heavily on his chest. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and James forced himself to focus on the rhythm of the movement, the way the ground slipped away beneath them. He reminded himself that this flight had an endpoint. Soon he would be home. Soon, this moment would just be another story to tell. But then something unexpected happened. From the row behind them, a voice spoke up, low and steady but firm. "Excuse me, sir." James turned slightly, catching sight of the man who had spoken earlier, the one in the business suit. He was leaning forward now, his gaze fixed on the older man beside James. "I have a question for you," the businessman continued. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was something in it that made people around them fall silent, listening. "What exactly is the problem here?" The older man stiffened. "I don't see how that's any of your business." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but it is, because you're making it everyone's business by causing a scene over where someone sits." "So, what's the real issue?" James watched as the older man's face darkened, his grip tightening on the armrest. He didn't answer right away, as if trying to decide how much further he wanted to take this. Passengers around them had begun paying even closer attention. The energy in the cabin had shifted. This wasn't just a passing moment anymore. It was something bigger, something that people weren't willing to let slide. James felt a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't used to people stepping in like this. He had learned a long time ago to handle these things on his own. But now sitting here, watching as others refused to let the older man's actions go unnoticed, something in him stirred. The older man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. The world really has changed, hasn't it?" His voice was bitter, but there was something else beneath it, something almost uncertain. The businessman didn't back down. "Yeah, it has. And maybe it's time you catch up." For the first time since this started, the older man had no response. He just sat there, his fingers tapping against the armrest, his expression unreadable. James turned away, looking out the window at the sky stretching endlessly beyond them. The tension hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had thickened. This flight was far from over. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the air between James and the older man was heavier than ever. The businessman's words had left an impact, not just on the people around them, but on the man himself. He sat stiffly in his seat, eyes locked on the window, his fingers drumming against his leg as if trying to contain something. Frustration, embarrassment, James couldn't tell. But one thing was clear: the man was struggling to swallow the shift in power. James had dealt with people like him before, men who thought their place in the world was set in stone, only to realize times had changed. But what made this moment different was the number of people watching, waiting, silently calling him out without saying a word. It was supposed to be a day of joy, a moment of celebration. Family, friends, and neighbors had all gathered to honor a remarkable milestone minus 100 years of life. Miss Hattie Mae Johnson, a beloved grandmother, had seen it all. Through the struggles of the past century, she had stood strong, raising children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren with love, wisdom, and resilience. But on this special day, the unthinkable happened. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Laughter filled the air as little ones ran around with balloons, and the smell of Miss Hattie's famous peach cobbler drifted from the kitchen. Her wrinkled hands, still strong despite her years, clapped along as her family sang Happy Birthday. It was a perfect moment, until the sirens shattered the peace. A police cruiser rolled up, its flashing lights washing over the front yard. The music stopped. Conversations hushed. People exchanged confused glances. There had been no trouble, no complaints, so why were the police here? The officer stepped out, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to join the celebration. He wasn't here to wish Miss Hattie a happy birthday. No, he was here for something else. Miss Hattie, sitting in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, lifted her tired eyes to meet his. Her voice, though soft, still carried the weight of 100 years of experience. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked. The officer took a step forward, his presence tense. "We got a report," he said flatly, glancing around at the crowd as if searching for something or someone. A murmur rippled through the guests. A report? Of what? Miss Hattie's eldest son, James, stepped forward. "Officer, this is a private family gathering. What seems to be the problem?" But the officer wasn't looking at James anymore. His gaze flickered back to Miss Hattie. And then, just like that, without warning, without reason, it happened. A sound so sharp and disgusting that it cut through the stunned silence. Spit. A thick blob landing on the very person who had lived through segregation, through marches, through change, through an entire century of history. The world seemed to freeze. Miss Hattie didn't flinch, didn't move. But the guests. Their gasps filled the air like a gust of wind before a storm. Faces twisted in shock, in disbelief, in outrage. 100 emotions surged at once, yet Miss Hattie remained still. The officer didn't speak, didn't explain. For a second, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Then, before anyone could react, he turned on his heel, walking away as if nothing had happened, as if this wasn't a moment that would be remembered forever. The crowd erupted. Voices rose, anger boiled over. Phones were out, cameras rolling. This was going to be seen. This was going to be known. But before the storm could fully break, before the night could spiral into something even darker, Miss Hattie finally moved. Slowly, she wiped her cheek with a trembling hand. And then, with a voice that carried the strength of generations, she spoke words that no one expected. And what she said next? It changed everything. Miss Hattie took a deep breath, her eyes steady, her voice calm but firm. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her fingers still lightly touching her cheek where the spit had landed. The crowd, still buzzing with shock and outrage, quieted just enough to hear her. The younger ones, fists clenched, breathing heavy, looked at her, waiting. They wanted her to tell them what to do. They wanted a reason to act. But Miss Hattie, even at 100 years old, knew better than to let anger lead the way. James stepped closer to his mother, his chest rising and falling, his hands balled into fists. "Mama, you all right?" She nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on the police officer walking back to his cruiser, like he had done nothing, like this was just another day. But for Miss Hattie, for everyone standing there, this wasn't just another day. This was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of love and reflection, not this. The murmurs around her grew louder. Someone shouted, "We got it on camera." Another voice, sharp and furious, added, "He can't just do that. Ain't no way we lettin' this slide." Miss Hattie finally looked away from the officer, her old but sharp eyes scanning the faces of her family, her neighbors, the children who had been laughing just moments ago, but now looked confused, scared, angry. "You'll listen to me," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to calm the storm that was brewing. "Not here, not like this." James frowned. "Mama." "I said not here," she repeated, her tone firmer now. James turned to her. "Mama, what are you saying?" She met his gaze, steady and unshaken. "I'm saying we need to see for ourselves." Aisha's eyes widened. "Grandma, no. That alley, if something happened to him there, it's not safe." Miss Hattie straightened her shoulders. "Neither is waiting around for someone else to tell us what's true." James hesitated. He had been raised to respect his mother's instincts, and right now, they were telling her something was waiting in that alley, something that needed to be seen. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we go together." The drive was tense, the only sound coming from Aisha's phone as she checked for updates. But the person who filmed the video was still silent. When they finally reached the alley, it looked just like the video, dark, empty, forgotten. The only sign of life was the officer's car, parked crooked, the driver's door still slightly open. James killed the engine. "We shouldn't be here long." They stepped out cautiously, the night air thick with something unspoken. The old train tracks stretched in the distance, rusted and unused. A streetlight flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows against the walls of abandoned buildings. The car was right in front of them now, close enough to touch. James reached out and slowly pulled the driver's door open. The inside smelled like sweat and something else, something faint but wrong. The officer was there, slumped in the seat, completely still. Aisha covered her mouth, taking a step back. "Oh my God." James checked his pulse. He was breathing. Faint, but still there. Miss Hattie stepped closer, looking him over. His uniform was still on, but something was missing. His badge, his belt, his gun. "He was left here," she said quietly. James frowned. "Left here by who?" A rustling sound made them all freeze. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward. "Marcus." James' eyes went wide. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus didn't speak right away. He looked from them to the officer, then back again. "I wasn't sure y'all would come." Aisha's voice was sharp. "What do you mean?" Marcus let out a slow breath. "I was the one who sent that video." Silence fell over them. James stepped forward. "You filmed that?" Marcus nodded. "I didn't know it was him at first. I was passing through, saw the car, figured something was off. Then I got closer and," he motioned to the officer, "saw him like this." Aisha's hands were shaking. "Why didn't you call the cops?" Marcus looked at her, his face unreadable. "And tell them what? That a dirty cop who got caught on camera disrespecting a 100-year-old black woman just happened to end up like this? You really think they believe I had nothing to do with it?" James clenched his jaw. "Then who did?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever it was, they wanted him found." Miss Hattie stared at the officer, her face unreadable. He had been so sure of himself just hours ago, standing in front of her house, spitting like she was nothing. And now? Now he was here, stripped of his authority, left behind like an afterthought. A low groan escaped his lips. He was waking up. James stepped back. "We need to go, now." Miss Hattie didn't move right away. She looked down at the officer, her voice calm but firm. "You remember me?" His eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. He stared up at her, blinking like he couldn't believe she was real. Then, just barely, he gave a weak nod. Miss Hattie exhaled, shaking her head. "I hope you do." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The walk back to the car felt heavier than before, like the night itself was pressing down on them. No one spoke, not even Aisha, who usually had something to say about everything. The only sound was the faint hum of the streetlight flickering above, the same light that had cast its glow over the officer slumped in his seat. James started the car, his grip tight on the wheel. "We're not talking about this again," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not to anybody." Aisha looked out the window, her fingers still gripping her phone, but she hadn't refreshed the page in minutes. "What if he tells someone we were there?" Miss Hattie let out a breath, slow and steady. "He won't." James glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "How do you know?" She met his eyes with a calm that only came from living a long life. "Because he's got too much to lose." They got out of the car, stepping onto the porch where everything had started. Aisha finally spoke again. "So, what happens now?" James shook his head. "Nothing. We go back to living our lives." Aisha let out a bitter laugh. "Like any of this ever happened." Miss Hattie reached out, taking Aisha's hand in hers. "No, baby," she said gently. "Like we know the truth, and that's enough." Aisha looked at her grandmother, searching for something in her expression. "Is it though?" Miss Hattie gave a small smile, the kind that carried more weight than words ever could. "Sometimes, knowing is all you get." James sat down on the porch steps, running a hand over his face. "You think they'll ever say what really happened to him?" Miss Hattie rocked back in her chair, gazing out at the quiet street. "Depends on who's telling the story." Aisha checked her phone one last time. No updates, no more videos, just silence. Whatever happened in that alley, whatever lesson had been taught to that man, the world wasn't going to get the real version. It would be spun into something else, twisted into a narrative that fit someone else's agenda. But they knew. And that was enough. The night stretched on softer now. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had settled into the background, part of the air they breathed. Miss Hattie leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a moment, listening to the quiet. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. People would talk, speculate, move on to the next scandal. But some things stayed. Some lessons left marks that didn't fade. And some people learned whether they wanted to or not. Miss Hattie opened her eyes, looking out at the darkness, the stars scattered across the sky. She had lived through enough to know how these things went. Power shifted in ways most people never saw. Justice didn't always come the way folks expected. But sometimes, just sometimes, it came in a way that couldn't be ignored. She rocked slowly, listening to the night, letting it hold the weight of everything left unsaid. Then, finally, she smiled. Her granddaughter, Aisha, tears glistening in her eyes, held up her phone. "It's already online, Grandma. People are seeing this right now." Miss Hattie sighed. She had lived long enough to see things change, yet somehow, too much had stayed the same. She remembered a time when there were no cameras, when men could do worse and walk away like they never did a thing. She remembered the protests, the marches, the nights spent crying over what she couldn't change. But she also remembered something else: patience, wisdom, the understanding that sometimes power didn't come from what you did in the heat of the moment, but how you moved when the world was watching. The officer reached his car, opened the door and paused, just for a second. He didn't look back, didn't say a word. Then he got in and drove off, the taillights disappearing down the street like a ghost slipping into the night. The tension didn't leave with him. It sat heavy in the air, thick like the summer heat. James ran a hand over his head, frustration written all over his face. "Mama, we can't just let this go." Miss Hattie finally stood up from her rocking chair. Even at 100, she still held her back straight, still moved with grace. She reached for James's hand and held it tight. "Boy, do you think this is the first time I've been disrespected? Do you think this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me?" James swallowed hard, his tough exterior cracking just a little in front of the woman who had raised him. "No, ma'am." She nodded. "Then don't act like we don't know how to handle this." Aisha stepped forward, eyes still on her phone screen. "Grandma, this is everywhere now. People are talking about it. They want to know who he is. They want to do something." Miss Hattie's lips pressed together. She wasn't naive. She knew what could come next. The media, the headlines, the debates. The anger could spread fast, maybe too fast, and once a fire started, it wasn't easy to put out. The rest of the family stood waiting, looking at her, waiting for direction. The whole world might be watching soon, but right now, in this moment, it was still her family's story. The question was, what would they do with it? The weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air. Miss Hattie knew the fire had already been lit, and there was no stopping it now. The younger generation wasn't like hers. They didn't wait. They didn't suffer in silence. They spoke up, they pushed back, and now with the internet, the world heard them almost instantly. Aisha was still staring at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "Grandma, it's everywhere. People are sharing it on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Some folks already found his name." James turned sharply. "What do you mean they found his name?" "Somebody recognized him," she said. "They posted his badge number, his record. Looks like he's had complaints before." Miss Hattie's jaw tightened, but she stayed quiet. She had lived long enough to know how quickly things could spiral. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about what could happen next. James exhaled hard, shaking his head. "This ain't just some random cop then. He'd been doing this." The murmurs grew again, louder this time. Neighbors who had stuck around after the incident were now forming small clusters, talking, debating, asking the same question. What do we do now? A younger man, Marcus, who lived down the street, spoke up. "We should march. Go down to the station, make him answer for this." A few heads nodded in agreement. Others weren't so sure. "Marching ain't enough," someone else said. "We need to press charges." James turned back to Miss Hattie. "Mama, we need to do something. You can't just let this ride." Miss Hattie looked at her son, her face unreadable. "You think I don't know that?" she said softly. Aisha glanced up. "Some news reporters are already messaging me. They want to talk to you, Grandma." Miss Hattie sighed. She had been here before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. She had seen the cameras come in after an injustice, had seen people rally behind a cause, had seen the anger rise, and then, just as quickly, seen it all fade away when the next big story came along. The real fight wasn't in the moment. It was in what happened after. James rubbed the back of his neck. "What do you want to do, Mama?" Miss Hattie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past the small crowd and out into the street where the officer had driven away. Somewhere out there, he was probably sitting at his desk, maybe even laughing about what he did. Maybe thinking it would all blow over in a day or two. Maybe he didn't realize who he had just spit on. She turned back to her family. "We ain't gonna act off emotion," she said finally. "We gonna move smart. We gonna move right."